After my husband's death, I kept quiet about the fact that he had signed the entire company over to me. At the memorial service, my son smirked and said, "Mom, I'm the boss now. Your place is cleaning my office bathroom." He had no idea what surprise was waiting for him at the office the very next morning. 40 days. 40 days. They say on the 40th day, the soul finally says its final farewell to the earthly world. I sat deep in an armchair in the parlor of our Hamptons estate, and it felt as if it was my soul preparing to leave, to follow him, my Victor. The house was packed with people, soft voices, the muted clink of glassware, the barely noticeable scent of expensive perfume mixed with the heavy, sweet fragrance of the lilacs I'd arranged for the service. Everything was done correctly, properly, just as it should be for the remembrance of a man of Victor Holloway's stature, the founder of the Sterling Reserve. From the outside, it might have looked like I, his widow, was the center of this sorrowful ritual, but I wasn't the center. I was behind glass, observing the events as if watching a silent scene in a play. Everyone who approached me offered the same words. "Maya, stay strong. Victor was a great man. What a loss." I nodded, thanked them, and even managed to force out something that resembled a smile. But their eyes looked right through me. They saw only the shadow of their partner, their boss, their friend, a beautiful, well-kept accessory to Victor's genius. They saw the woman who for 40 years had orchestrated perfect dinner parties, selected the right linens, and made sure every guest's glass was promptly refilled. None of them had any idea that it was during those very dinners, beneath the clinking of glasses and the quiet crackle of the fireplace, that the most critical deals were finalized. That it was me, simply Maya, who spent hours on the phone with Belgian chocolatiers and French curs, not discussing contracts, but their children, their gardens, their joys, and their sorrows. Victor called it the social glue. He used to say, "Maya, I build the walls, but you fill the house with life. Without you, it's just a stone box." Now the box felt empty. In my lap rested a slim folder of embossed leather. I hadn't let it out of my sight since the day the notary, an old family friend, handed it to me. "This is Victor's final wish," he'd said. "He asked that I give this to you personally and only after the official will has been read to the others." The official will was predictable. The estate, the city penthouse, the investment accounts, everything was split between my son and me. The company, however, was not mentioned in the official papers. Everything was right here in this folder. I knew what was inside. I had scanned the lines in the notary's office and hadn't opened it again. I couldn't. It felt too much like a betrayal, reading about a future without him, when my own heart felt like it had stopped. 100% of the shares of the Sterling Reserve passed to my sole ownership, his final gift, his final trust. I mindlessly ran my fingers over the folder's smooth surface. It was the only thing that felt real in this buzzing, blurry haze of unfamiliar faces and empty words. Poor Maya. How will she manage on her own now? I overheard two women whispering by the fireplace. Victor managed everything. She was just his wife. I wasn't offended. They were merely voicing what everyone thought, what apparently even my own son Grant thought. I found him with my eyes. He wasn't grieving, he was animated. He stood at the center of a group of men in expensive suits, our top executives, explaining something to them with fervor, gesturing energetically. A corporate, confident smile played on his face. He was already trying on his father's chair for size. In his movements, the way he adjusted his tie, the way he condescendingly patted our chief financial officer, Arthur Vance, on the shoulder, there was the impatient anticipation of tomorrow, the day he would become the full and undisputed owner. My heart tightened with a new, distinct pain, not from sorrow, but from something cold and sharp. Victor adored his son, but he was never blind. "He has much of my drive, Maya," he told me one evening in his study, "but little of your soul. He sees numbers, not people. I fear one day it will destroy him." Grant noticed my gaze. Saying goodbye to his audience, he headed toward me. Arthur Vance, our longtime family friend, followed him like a faithful aide. "Mom," Grant stopped in front of me, blocking the light from the tall floor lamp. His voice, usually so much like Victor's, sounded different now. It had a metallic edge I'd never heard before. "We need to talk." He didn't wait for a response and led me
toward the buffet table, laden with the exquisite appetizers I had personally selected that morning. Imported caviar, delicate pâtés, rare cheeses, everything that made up the pride of our company, the work of his father's life. "I've been thinking," he began, taking a canapé topped with black caviar from a tray. He didn't even look at the food. He just popped it into his mouth as something entirely expected. "Starting tomorrow, I officially take over, so Dad's office is mine now. You'll need to clear out his personal effects, and yours too. From the estate, I mean. I plan to redecorate and host corporate receptions here for business, you understand? You won't be comfortable here anymore. You'll move into the city penthouse. It's smaller, but it will be enough for just you." He said this so casually, so simply, as if discussing rearranging furniture, as if he wasn't evicting me from the home where I had lived for 40 years, where every corner held the memory of his father. I remained silent. A strange numbness grew in my chest. Grant smirked, noticing my silence. He seemed to mistake it for compliance, the confusion of a weak woman who needed to be put in her place. "And another thing," he added, wiping his fingers on a napkin. "You'll have a pension, don't worry, but sitting idle is bad for you at your age. You need to stay, engaged. Your place now." He looked me up and down with an appraising gaze, and a flash of open disdain crossed his eyes. "Well, you can start by tidying up my office bathroom." He uttered those last words quietly, almost intimately, leaning into me. They held such venom, such a desire to humiliate that the air around me seemed to freeze. In that instant, something broke, or perhaps something new was forged. The heavy, suffocating lump of grief in my chest didn't vanish, but it was suddenly covered in a thin crust of ice. The clinking of glasses, the voices, the music, all the sounds instantly faded, as if someone had pulled an invisible switch. I stopped smelling the lilies and the expensive cigars. The whole world narrowed down to 2 points: my son's self-satisfied face and the smooth, cool surface of the folder with the will on my lap. I realized with deafening clarity he hadn't just insulted me. On the day of his father's memorial, in the home his father built, he had trampled on Victor's memory. He hadn't just humiliated his mother, he had humiliated 40 years of life, 40 years of partnership, 40 years of love upon which this entire empire was built. Instead of blood, icy water seemed to flow through my veins, calm, transparent, carrying not fury, but absolute, ringing clarity. Standing before me was not my son. Standing before me was a stranger, someone who was about to destroy everything that Victor and I held dear. The internal shift was complete. The fight for the inheritance had not yet begun. The fight for honor had. I slowly turned and walked away from the buffet table. I didn't say a word to Grant, nor did I grant him a glance. The icy composure that filled me was stronger than any armor. I walked through the parlor, past the sympathetic faces and sorrowful whispers, ascended the stairs to our master suite, and closed the door behind me. The noise of the service remained somewhere in another life. My life, the one before this day, had ended 40 days ago. The one I'd had just an hour ago ended with my son's last word. I waited until the last car had pulled away from the house and everything downstairs had fallen silent. Only then did I leave the suite and descend to the first floor. The house smelled of stale candle wax, lilies, and betrayal. Without turning on the lights, I walked down the hall to Victor's study. This was the heart of the home, the core of his life. Heavy oak paneling, bookshelves reaching the ceiling, the massive desk where his half-empty cup of tea still sat. I sank into his oversized leather armchair. It still held his warmth, his scent, the faint aroma of sandalwood and fine tobacco. How many nights had I sat just like this in the chair opposite, listening as he shared his plans, his fears, his dreams? The Sterling Reserve was more than just a business. It was our mutual child, born out of a love for quality, out of respect for tradition. "Your place is cleaning my office bathroom." The phrase echoed in the hollow silence of the study. It didn't provoke tears. The tears had dried up. It only provoked a cold, detached curiosity. How could a man who grew up in this house, who saw his father build his reputation piece by piece, stoop so low? How could he so devalue everything that defined our family? He sees the company as a machine, a collection of assets, warehouses, and logistics chains. He thinks it's enough to sit in his father's chair, hang his own portrait on the wall, and the mechanism will continue to work, spitting out money. He doesn't understand that Victor didn't build a mechanism. He built a family that extended far beyond this house. It lived in Brussels, on Céline plantations, in small fishing villages on the coast of France. Its members were people whose families had spent centuries making the best chocolate, tea, and caviar in the world. People for whom the word honor was not an empty sound, but the foundation of their life's work. This is why my first thought wasn't about lawyers. Showing Grant the folder with the will would have been too easy. It would have been his language, a language of documents, power, and formalities. It wouldn't have changed anything in his soul. He would simply have hated me even more, but he still wouldn't have understood his fundamental mistake. No, I had to speak to him in his father's language, the language he unfortunately had never learned. I reached out to the bottom shelf of the desk and pulled out a heavy, thick journal with an embossed leather cover. This was my personal notebook, not for business contacts. For that, we had secretaries and electronic databases. This contained other numbers, personal home numbers I called to congratulate on the birth of a grandchild, ask about their health, or simply chat about small things. Victor would laugh and call it my spider web. My dear, you've woven your web around half the world, and our partners hold on to us not through steel contracts, but through your subtle, invisible threads. Now was the time to test a strength of those threads. I opened the book to the letter D. Charlotte Dubois, owner of a small but legendary chocolate factory in Brussels. We met nearly 35 years ago at an exhibition in Paris. Our husbands were discussing supply terms, while Charlotte and I slipped away for coffee and discovered we had far more in common than just our husband's business. Since then, she had become more than a partner. She was a dear friend. I dialed her number, long, drawn-out rings. On the other end, her slightly raspy, always energetic voice answered, "Hello?" "Oh, Charlotte, my dear, it's Maya. My goodness, I was just thinking about you all day. How are you, my sweet? How was the service?" Her voice was full of genuine warmth and sympathy. I closed my eyes for a moment, allowing that warmth to touch my frozen heart. It went as it should. There were many people. Everyone remembered Victor. I tried to keep my voice steady. He was a great man, Maya, a true original. They don't make them like that anymore. I lit a candle for him at the cathedral. "Thank you, Charlotte. I'm calling you, actually, for this reason." I paused, choosing my words. "I just wanted to let you know we have some changes coming. Grant is taking the reins." A short silence followed on the other end. Charlotte was too smart not to catch the hidden meaning in my words. "I understand," she finally said, her voice turning serious. "Grant is a good boy, but he's different. He's a child of the new century." "Exactly," I confirmed quietly. "He's a child of the new century. so I'm just calling my old friends just to check in, to thank them for the years of friendship. I hear you, Maya, Charlotte said firmly. You can always count on me. Whatever happens, call me if you need anything, anytime. Thank you, dear. That's all I needed to hear. We said our goodbyes. I hung up and sat motionless for a few minutes. The first thread held fast. It was stronger than steel. I turned the page. Sri Lanka. Mr. Sundareem, owner of the tea plantations that supplied us with the exclusive blend found only in our stores. His father had worked with Victor's father. I remembered Mr. Sundareem flying in for our 25th anniversary wedding and bringing a potted tea sapling as a gift. It still grew in our conservatory. I called him. He was, as always, exquisitely polite and respectful. I asked about his family, the new harvest, and then, as cautiously as I had with Charlotte, I mentioned the new leadership. He was silent for a long moment, then spoke with a gentle accent. Madame Maya, our family has worked with your family for 2 generations. To us, the sterling reserve is Mr. Victor and you. Everything else is just words on paper. We remember kindness. The third call was to France, to Monsieur Laurent, whose small family-owned business.
Holloway, there are things that are not for sale. Reputation is one of them. My reputation is tied to yours. I will not forget this. Hanging up after the third conversation, I felt the ice in my chest begin to melt, giving way to something new. It wasn't hope. It was certainty. My spider web was intact. For 40 years I had woven it with threads of friendship, respect, and human warmth. And now that spider web was transforming into a net that would very soon ensnare the one who fancied himself the hunter. I closed the notebook. The study was still dark and quiet, but now the silence wasn't oppressive. It was filled with power. I had made my first move, and I had made it not as an offended mother or a humiliated widow, but as the owner of the sterling reserve. My son didn't know it yet, but the war for the soul of his father's company had already begun, and I wasn't about to lose it. The coup. I sat in the study until dawn. When the first gray rays touched the spines of the books, I got up and quietly went to my room. I didn't go to sleep. I just waited for the sound of footsteps on the stairs, the sound of the front door closing. That was the sound of the beginning of his new day, the day of his triumph. I didn't see it with my own eyes, but I know my son. I know Arthur. I can imagine every detail of his first day at the office, the day he thought would be the start of his empire. He surely arrived at 9 o'clock, not a minute later. He walked into the building steeped in the aromas of Ceylonese tea, Belgian chocolate, and old wood, the scent of a legacy that he likely didn't even notice. To him, it was just the smell of money. His father's secretary, Miss Davis, a woman who had worked with us since day one, must have met him at the entrance with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Grant Holloway, please accept my condolences." I'm certain he just gave an impatient nod, tossing over his shoulder. "Thanks, Miss Davis. Get me a black coffee, no sugar, and send Vance in." The first thing he did upon entering his father's study was to take down his portrait, a large, heavy-framed oil painting done about 10 years ago. Victor smiled in it, calmly, wisely, with a slight twinkle in his eye. To me, that portrait was more than just an image. It was the soul of the office, its conscience. Grant, without batting an eye, moved it, propping it face to the wall in a corner like useless junk. In its place, he hung his own glossy photograph in a thin metal frame, young, arrogant, with a predatory smile and a gaze fixed somewhere above people's heads, the look of a man who saw the world as an Excel spreadsheet. Then, Arthur Vance, our CFO and family friend, a man Victor had once mentored, helped, and brought into the business, entered the study. Arthur was always the epitome of obsequiousness.
He hunched slightly, spoke in an ingratiating voice, and looked up at everyone, creating an impression of humility and loyalty. But I knew that behind that mask hid a cold, calculating mind. "Grant, Mr. Holloway." Arthur surely stopped at the threshold, feigning reverence. "Congratulations, you are in your rightful place. Victor would be proud." "Spare me, Arthur." I can practically hear my son's impatient, businesslike tone. Dad was a genius, but his methods are outdated. Sentimentality, personal relationships, that's not how business is done in the 21st century. It's time to clean house, time to optimize. He sat in his father's chair. It must have been too large for him, but he didn't notice. He surveyed the office with an owner's gaze and rubbed his hands together. "All right, the first order of the new management." He paused dramatically. "We need to cut costs immediately. I've looked at the reports. Our suppliers are sitting on a gold mine. For decades they've dictated their prices, hiding behind fairy tales of exclusivity and handmade quality. Enough." "Absolutely, Grant." Arthur surely chimed in immediately. "I completely agree. Procurement costs are our single largest expense. But Grant, you know those old-timers, they're very touchy. Victor spent years building those friendships." Grant laughed, a cold, unpleasant laugh. "He bought that friendship with our money. And the truth is, my mother handled all that. All her tea parties, phone calls, little Christmas gifts. How many lost man-hours, how much wasted cash, what inefficiency." I imagined him leaning back in the chair, and the same disdain I heard yesterday at the buffet table was in his voice. "She's just a sentimental old woman, Arthur, and she surrounded herself with the same dinosaurs. She thinks her friendship will pay our bills. But you and I know that the world is ruled not by smiles, but by money, hard, cold cash. So, what do you propose?" In Arthur's voice, I'm sure there was the genuine interest of a predator sniffing blood. "It's simple. You'll prepare a standard email right now for all key suppliers: Charlotte in Brussels, the tea merchant in Sri Lanka, the French with their caviar. Short and to the point. Due to a change in leadership and new company commercial policy, we demand a 20% reduction in purchasing prices across the entire assortment. New terms are effective immediately. That's it. No courtesies, no dear partners. This is business. They either accept our terms, or we'll find others. No one is indispensable." Arthur must have frozen for a moment. Even for him, this was too radical. "Grant, it's risky. They might take offense. These aren't corporations, they're family businesses." "They're businessmen." Grant laughed, a cold, unpleasant laugh. "He bought that friendship with our money. And the truth is, my mother handled all that. All her tea parties, phone calls, little Christmas gifts. How many lost man-hours, how much wasted cash, what inefficiency." I imagined him leaning back in the chair, and the same disdain I heard yesterday at the buffet table was in his voice. "She's just a sentimental old woman, Arthur, and she surrounded herself with the same dinosaurs. She thinks her friendship will pay our bills. But you and I know that the world is ruled not by smiles, but by money, hard, cold cash. So, what do you propose?" In Arthur's voice, I'm sure there was the genuine interest of a predator sniffing blood. "It's simple. You'll prepare a standard email right now for all key suppliers: Charlotte in Brussels, the tea merchant in Sri Lanka, the French with their caviar. Short and to the point. Due to a change in leadership and new company commercial policy, we demand a 20% reduction in purchasing prices across the entire assortment. New terms are effective immediately. That's it. No courtesies, no dear partners. This is business. They either accept our terms, or we'll find others. No one is indispensable." Arthur must have frozen for a moment. Even for him, this was too radical. "Grant, it's risky. They might take offense. These aren't corporations, they're family businesses." "They're businessmen." Grant laughed, a cold, unpleasant laugh. "He bought that friendship with our money. And the truth is, my mother handled all that. All her tea parties, phone calls, little Christmas gifts. How many lost man-hours, how much wasted cash, what inefficiency! I imagined him leaning back in the chair, and the same disdain I heard yesterday at the buffet table was in his voice. She's just a sentimental old woman, Arthur, and she surrounded herself with the same dinosaurs. She thinks her friendship will pay our bills. But you and I know that the world is ruled not by smiles, but by money. Hard, cold cash. So, what do you propose? In Arthur's voice, I'm sure there was the genuine interest of a predator sniffing blood. It's simple. You'll prepare a standard email right now for all key suppliers: Charlotte in Brussels, the tea merchant in Sri Lanka, the French with their caviar. Short and to the point. Due to a change in leadership and new company commercial policy, we demand a 20% reduction in purchasing prices across the entire assortment. New terms are effective immediately. That's it. No courtesies, no dear partners. This is business. They either accept our terms or we'll find others. No one is indispensable. Arthur must have frozen for a moment. Even for him, this was too radical. Grant, it's risky. They might take offense. These aren't corporations. They're family businesses. They're businessmen. Grant laughed, a cold, unpleasant laugh. He bought that friendship with our money. And the truth is, my mother handled all that. All her tea parties, phone calls, little Christmas gifts. How many lost man-hours, how much wasted cash, what inefficiency! I imagined him leaning back in the chair, and the same disdain I heard yesterday at the buffet table was in his voice. She's just a sentimental old woman, Arthur, and she surrounded herself with the same dinosaurs. She thinks her friendship will pay our bills. But you and I know that the world is ruled not by smiles, but by money. Hard, cold cash. So, what do you propose? In Arthur's voice, I'm sure there was the genuine interest of a predator sniffing blood. It's simple. You'll prepare a standard email right now for all key suppliers: Charlotte in Brussels, the tea merchant in Sri Lanka, the French with their caviar. Short and to the point. Due to a change in leadership and new company commercial policy, we demand a 20% reduction in purchasing prices across the entire assortment. New terms are effective immediately. That's it. No courtesies, no dear partners. This is business. They either accept our terms or we'll find others. No one is indispensable. Arthur must have frozen for a moment. Even for him, this was too radical. Grant, it's risky. They might take offense. These aren't corporations. They're family businesses. They are businessmen, Grant cut him off, and they know how to count money. They'll complain for show. They'll whine about a tough life. But when the prospect of losing their largest client looms over them, they'll become agreeable. Trust me, the old guard is gone. A new era, an era of efficiency, has begun. I can imagine Arthur looking at the new portrait on the wall, then at Grant's confident face, and a slow, understanding smile blossoming on his lips. He saw strength, or rather what he mistook for strength. "You're right," he said, and his voice became smooth and anxious again. "Absolutely right. It's time to shake up this sleepy kingdom. I'll prepare the draft email immediately." "Perfect." Grant must have nodded with satisfaction. "Send it out today. Enough sitting around while my mother plays solitaire at the estate and mourns the past. We are building the future." He was wrong about only one thing. I wasn't playing solitaire. I was waiting precisely for this, their fatal, arrogant mistake. That day, from our office, from the heart of my husband's company, a flurry of short, soulless emails scattered across the globe. Every word in them was an insult. Every figure was a slap in the face of 40 years of friendship and trust. They hit send, certain they were launching a mechanism of optimization. They had no idea they had launched a mechanism of self-destruction. The crashing tide. I wasn't wrong in my expectations. The replies to my son's ultimatum began to arrive the very next day. Or rather, it was an absolutely devastating icy silence. No one called. No one wrote back to the rude electronic order. In the world of big corporations where Grant lived, silence meant consent or the start of negotiation. But in our world, the world of Mr. Sundaram, Mr. Laurent, and Charlotte Dubois, silence was the most terrible verdict. It was a sign of contempt, a sign that you had ceased to exist.
I knew that Grant and Arthur at the office interpreted this silence as their victory. They were surely sitting in Victor's study, sipping cognac and congratulating each other on a clever move. See, Arthur, I told you they swallowed it. Now they'll know their place. Their smugness was so predictable that I could feel it even here, miles away in the silence of our estate. I was doing what I always did, caring for the life in this house. I was repotting Victor's favorite orchids. He used to say they were like me, fragile on the outside, but with an unbreakable inner core. I carefully cleaned the roots, prepared the fresh soil, and this measured, familiar work was calming. It was real, unlike the false, hurried rat race currently happening at the company. The phone call caught me off guard. I recognized the number. Brussels. My heart paused for a moment, then began to beat steadily and strongly. It had begun. May. Charlotte's voice on the line was unrecognizable. It wasn't just serious like last time. It was hard as steel, ringing with suppressed fury. Yes, Charlotte, I'm listening. I got it. This letter from your son. She spat the words out as if they were poison. It's not even a letter. It's a slap in the face. A 20% demand immediately after 35 years of partnership, after everything between our families? Does he think we're faceless conveyor belt suppliers? Does he think my chocolate is just cocoa beans and sugar that can be assessed by stock market quotes? I remained silent, letting her vent. Her anger was justified. It was the anger of a person whose honor had been insulted. My husband, God rest his soul, would turn over in his grave if he saw this. Victor and I worked on a handshake for 20 years before we signed the first official contract, because his word was more reliable than any paperwork. And this boy? I know, Charlotte, I said quietly. I know everything. And I'm so sorry you had to read that. Sorry, May? I'm not sorry. I'm furious, she exclaimed. I've already prepared the official response, a termination of all shipments. My chocolate will never appear in your stores again. Not while... She
Suddenly stopped, took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. But I'm not calling about that, she said in a different tone, quiet, tense, full of dread. That letter was just an insult. But what happened an hour later, that's something else entirely. I froze with the orchid pot in my hands. Dirt scattered onto the floor, but I didn't notice. What happened, Charlotte? I received an official request from the legal department of Omnicorp. At those words, the cold that had only thinly crusted over my grief pierced me right through to the heart. Omnicorp, the cheap, faceless conglomerate that bought up famous brands and sucked the soul out of them. They left only the name, and under it, they sold mass-produced, low-grade products made in gigantic automated factories. Victor hated them with all his heart. He called them the grave diggers of quality. They don't create, Maya, he'd often say. They only destroy. They take the history, the reputation, the life's work of true masters, and they turn it into dust. A line in the quarterly report. It's the worst kind of barbarism. Barbarism in a business suit. What did they want? My voice sounded hollow, as if from a well. They wanted confirmation of the terms of my exclusive contract with the Sterling Reserve, Charlotte said slowly, articulating every word. They informed me they are in the final stages of a merger and acquisition of your company. They plan to buy you out, May. Completely. They wanted to make sure the contracts with key suppliers, that is me, would remain in force after the change of ownership. May? What in the hell is going on over there? I sank onto a side table. The pot slipped from my hands and shattered, scattering soil and the orchid's pale, delicate roots across the floor. But I didn't hear the sound. I only heard the deafening roar in my ears. This wasn't just betrayal. It was desecration. Grant and Arthur, they didn't just want to take the company from me. They didn't just want to kick me out of the house and humiliate me. It was much worse. They had planned from the beginning to sell Victor's life's work to his fiercest enemy, the one he despised most in the world. They were going to take his name, his reputation, his legacy, and hand it over to the grave diggers of quality. And now I understood everything. Their haste, their cruelty. The demand for a 20% discount wasn't just greed. It was pre-sale preparation. They wanted to show Omnicorp they could optimize costs and squeeze even more profit from the suppliers. They were boosting the company's investment appeal before slaughtering it like a hog at a fair. And Arthur Vance, the family friend, he was there the whole time.
He looked me in the eye at the memorial, offered words of sympathy, and behind my back, he was cutting deals with the murderers of Victor's business. He manipulated my son, playing on his greed and vanity to pull off this transaction and line his own pockets. My blood turned to ice. The pain from Grant's words at the memorial was nothing compared to this. That was a blow against me. This was a stab in Victor's back. The dead cannot defend themselves. They cannot uphold their honor. Then I must. The battle for the company was over before it began. Now this was a war for my husband's soul. And in this war, I had no right to lose. Charlotte, my dear. My voice was calm, but it held a firmness she didn't expect from me. I ask one thing of you. Don't send any official replies yet. Do something else. Tell everyone, tell all our mutual friends about this request from Omnicorp. Call Mr. Sundaram, call Monsieur Laurent. They need to know the fate planned for the business we all served. They need to know that their names and reputations are about to be sold at auction. A pause followed on the other end, and then I heard a quiet, almost a rock gasp. I hear you, May, Charlotte said, and in her voice there was no longer anger. There was the cold, calculating fury of an ally. Consider it done. The gravediggers won't get this feast. After that conversation, I hung up and went out to the garden. The day was clear and cool. I picked up my shears and walked to the rose bushes. This was my ritual, my sanctuary. By trimming the faded blooms and dry branches, I wasn't just tidying the bushes. I was tidying my thoughts. Each snip of the blades echoed in the silence like a metronome, counting down the last hours of the old world. I knew that across the invisible threads of my spider web, the news was flying from Brussels to Sri Lanka, from there to France to Italy to Spain. This was not a business message. It was a cry for help, an alarm signal passed from one old friend to another. News of betrayal, that the Sterling Reserve was in danger, that it was about to be
ransacked by barbarians. I knew what the answer would be. The unveiling. Meanwhile, in a sterile glass conference room somewhere in downtown Manhattan, my son was celebrating his victory. I didn't see it, but I can imagine every moment of his triumph. He stood at the head of a long table of dark, polished wood. Before him were 3 people in equally expensive, faceless suits, the Omnicorp leadership. They had the same watches, the same tight smiles, and the same dead eyes. The eyes of people for whom the world consisted only of numbers, charts, and stock tickers. Grant surely felt he was on top of the world. He was proud. He was showing them a presentation on the huge screen. Slides flipped by. Logistics optimization, profit growth potential, brand synergies. He rattled off these empty foreign words, not understanding that behind every percentage on his charts stood people's lives, generations of masters, centuries of tradition. He was selling them something he hadn't created, and he wasn't even attempting to understand the value of what he sold. And as you can see, gentlemen, he proclaimed, pointing a laser pointer at a chart, after the work we conducted with our suppliers, we project a 20% reduction in procurement costs as early as this quarter. This frees up our capital and makes the Sterling Reserve an even more attractive asset. He surely paused, expecting applause. The Omnicorp people didn't applaud. They only nodded, almost imperceptibly. To them, this was routine. At that moment, his phone lying on the table vibrated. The screen showed Sam Jones, warehouse manager. Grant frowned. What an inappropriate interruption during his moment of glory. He dismissed the call with a swipe of his finger without even looking. Thus he continued, restoring his self-satisfied smile. We are handing you over not just a company. We are handing you a finely tuned mechanism with enormous potential, and most importantly, exclusive long-term contracts for the world's finest delicacies. This is our greatest treasure. The phone vibrated again, persistent. Sam Jones, warehouse manager. The irritation on Grant's face was now undisguised. How dare some warehouse clerk distract him when the fate of millions was being decided? He dismissed the call again and pointedly placed the phone face down. One of the men in suits slightly raised an eyebrow. Grant was already opening his mouth to deliver the concluding, most bombastic part of his speech, but he didn't get to finish. The conference room door burst open. Standing in the doorway was Sam Jones.
An older man who had worked with Victor for 30 years, pale, bewildered in his work jacket. He looked like an alien in this kingdom of glass and polished wood. "Mr. Holloway," he gasped, ignoring the icy stares of the Omnicorp men. "Sam Jones, are you insane?" Grant hissed, his face red with fury and shame. "I'm in a meeting. Get out of here." "The ships?" The old man stammered, not hearing him. "The ships?" They turned around. A silence fell, so thick and heavy it felt tangible. "What?" Grant asked, not believing his ears. "All of them? Every single one?" Sam Jones's voice trembled. "The port just called and a notice came from Brussels, from Ceylon. A refusal of all shipments. All cargo is halted. The ships that were already at sea are turning around." Grant stood and stared at him silently. The color slowly drained from his face, leaving behind a deathly pallor. The confident smile slipped away, revealing the confusion of a small boy. Behind him, the slide with the profit rev chart still glowed on the huge screen. Now it looked like a cruel joke. The Omnicorp men exchanged silent glances. There was no sympathy or surprise in their eyes, only cold, sober calculation. One of them slowly, almost lazily closed his laptop. The click sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence. "It seems," he said in a level, indifferent voice, addressing his colleagues, not Grant, "that the subject of negotiations has been exhausted. Their deal was built on one single foundation, the exclusive supplier contracts they couldn't get on their own. Without Belgian chocolate, without French caviar, without Celine's tea. The Sterling Reserve was just an empty building with a beautiful name, and now that building had collapsed. My son's humiliation was complete, and worst of all for him, public. He stood amid the ruins of his triumph before the people to whom he had just sold greatness, but in the end had demonstrated only his own. The surprise had begun. The verdict. I didn't hear them leave. I didn't see my son, pale and crushed, standing alone in the conference room that should have been his moment of victory, but I knew what would follow.
Anger, confusion, and then the search for someone to blame. And in their distorted worldview, anyone could be blamed but themselves. I waited for them in the garden. I wasn't hiding. I was simply where I belonged, in my world I had created and nurtured for decades. The sun warmed my shoulders. The air was thick with the sweet, honeyed scent of the blooming roses. I held a small pair of gardening shears and methodically clipped the spent blossoms to give strength to the new ones. This work demanded attention and calm. It did not tolerate haste. I heard them long before I saw them. First, the furious squeal of tires at the estate gates, a sound utterly foreign to this place. Then, the car doors slammed shut so hard it sounded like they'd been kicked open. Gravel crunched under quick, heavy footsteps. They didn't enter the house. They burst into it. "Mom!" Grant's shout echoed through the first floor and spilled out onto the terrace. "Where are you?" I didn't answer. I carefully cut a deep burgundy, almost black rose, a black baccara, and placed it in my woven basket. A moment later, they appeared on the path leading to the rose garden. They looked like two cornered animals. Grant was disheveled, his jacket unbuttoned, his tie pulled to the side. His face was distorted by a grimace of fury and despair. Arthur followed him, trying to maintain some composure, but his darting eyes and deathly pallor betrayed his panic. They stopped a few feet from me, breathing heavily. Their aggressive energy invaded the harmony of my garden like a dissonant chord. "Mom, what did you do?" Grant shouted again, unable to control himself. His voice cracked. "What did you tell them?" I slowly straightened up, turned to him, and looked him straight in the eye. My gaze was calm. I felt neither fear nor anger, only cold, heavy pity. "What are you talking about, Grant?" "Don't pretend. The suppliers, they all canceled, every single one. Contracts are torn up, shipments are stopped. You called them, you ruined everything." He waved his arms as if trying to shake the answers out of the air. Arthur put a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him, but more likely seeking support. "Miss Holloway," Arthur began in his ingratiating voice, which now contained a steel tremor. "We are in a very serious situation. The company is paralyzed." Mr. Holloway spoke hastily, but essentially he is right. "We know you talk to our partners. We ask you, no, we demand that you call them immediately and smooth over this misunderstanding. You have to fix this. You have to." His words carried an order,
a humiliated lackey, suddenly fancying himself a lord. I shifted my gaze from my son's rage-filled face to the tense face of the family friend, and then I turned back to the rosebush, and with one precise, careful movement, clipped another faded flower. The snip of the shears sounded deafeningly loud in the silence that followed. "I didn't call them to cancel anything, Grant," I said quietly, but my voice carried throughout the garden. "I called them as a friend to say goodbye." Grant froze, looking at me confused. "Say goodbye? What are you talking about? What friendship? This is business. You don't understand any of this. You messed everything up with your senioritis." "It is you who didn't understand, son," I replied just as calmly. I placed the shears in the basket and looked at both of them. Neither of you understood. You thought your father's company was walls, warehouses, and numbers and reports. But it is people. It is the trust he built for 40 years. Trust that you destroyed in 2 days. I didn't tell them to cancel shipments. I simply let them know that the old world of the Sterling Reserve no longer existed, and they chose not to deal with the new one. "That's a lie," Grant screamed. "They would never do that over some sentimental nonsense. You talked them into something. You slandered me." I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the roses, the scent of the world I was about to protect. "I only told them the truth," I said, looking straight into the eyes of my son, and then Arthur. "I told them that you disrespect them, that you insulted them with your ultimatum. And I paused, letting the words gain weight. I told them that you were trying to sell them, along with me, along with your father's legacy, to Omnicorp." The air froze. A bee buzzing near the bush suddenly stopped. Even the wind seemed to cease breathing. They froze like two statues. Grant's face slowly lost its expression of fury, giving way to complete, absolute confusion, which instantly morphed into terror. He looked at me as if I had spoken a dead language and uttered a terrible curse. But Arthur's face was worse. His mask of compliance and control cracked,
crumbled into dust. Beneath it was the face of a cornered predator. His eyes glazed over with shock. His jaw dropped. He understood. He understood everything. Their biggest, most carefully guarded secret was no longer a secret. Their plan, their meticulously calculated scheme, their betrayal, it was all exposed. They stood amid my blooming garden, amid a world built on honor and respect. Their own lie made manifest was suffocating them, preventing them from breathing or speaking. Arthur was the first to recover from the shock. Fear is the best catalyst. He saw the abyss opening beneath his feet, and the instinct for self-preservation prompted him to make one last desperate move. He instantly changed tactics. The panic on his face was replaced by a mask of corporate urgency, and his voice took on false notes of distress and concern. "Miss Holloway," he exclaimed, taking a step forward and shielding the frozen Grant. "Thank God you're aware. We didn't want to worry you until everything was finalized. You don't understand the full picture." He spoke quickly, hurriedly, as if afraid I would interrupt him. "Yes, we were negotiating with Omnicorp, but it was a necessary step, the only way to save the company. You simply don't know the state Victor left things in. Debts, cash flow gaps, outdated contracts. The company is on the verge of bankruptcy." He was lying blatantly, desperately, looking me right in the eye. He was trying to weave a new reality in which they were not traitors, but saviors. Grant, hearing the familiar words about saving the company, began to snap out of his stupor. He grasped Arthur's lie like a drowning man grasping at a straw. "Yes, Mom, Arthur's right," he chimed in, hysterical hope in his voice. "Dad, he was hiding problems from us. We wanted to fix everything and then tell you. And now it's all ruined, but it's not too late." Arthur immediately seized the moment. He opened the folder he'd been holding all this time and pulled out a few sheets of paper. "Here." He stepped even closer and nearly thrust the documents into my face. "Miss Holloway, you must sign this immediately. This is a power of attorney transferring emergency powers to Grant Holloway. It will give him the right to act on behalf of all owners to reanimate the deal with Omnicorp. It's our last chance. If you don't sign, the company will declare bankruptcy tomorrow. You will destroy your husband's life's work." This was their final gambit,
a mixture of blackmail, threats, and fabricated panic. They were pressing on my most painful spots: my supposed business incompetence, my fear of complex terminology, my guilt for the company's collapse. They still saw me as a weak, sentimental widow who could be intimidated and forced to comply. They thought I would break. I didn't even glance at the papers he held out. I calmly placed the basket of roses on the garden bench. Then I put the shears in there. Only then, unhurriedly, did I pull out the other item from the basket, the slim, embossed leather folder I hadn't parted with since the memorial. I held it in my hands, feeling its smooth, cool surface. It was my shield, my sword, my answer to all their lies. "You're talking about these papers, Arthur?" I asked quietly. They both stared uncomprehensively at the folder in my hands. They didn't know what it was. To them, it was just another object from the sentimental old woman's world. I stepped toward them. They instinctively backed away. I stopped right in front of Arthur and held the folder out to him. "Take it. Read it." He hesitated, looking suspiciously at me, then at the folder. Grant peered over his shoulder. Finally, Arthur tentatively took it. His fingers trembled as he opened it. I watched their faces. This was the moment of truth, the moment when their world built on lies and arrogance was about to crumble into dust. First, Arthur scanned the first page, his eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Then he began to read more carefully. His eyes widened with every line. His breathing became shallow. The color completely drained from his face, leaving a sickly gray pallor. The folder would have slipped from his weakening hands if Grant hadn't caught it. "What is it?" he asked impatiently, and then his own gaze devoured the document. I saw the same thing on my son's face, the slow, terrifying realization, the shattering of all hope, a complete, crushing defeat. The folder contained only 2 pages, the last will and testament of Victor Holloway concerning his company, a short, clear, unambiguous text stating that 100% of the shares of the Sterling Reserve, Inc., upon his death, passed into the sole and full ownership of his wife, Maya Holloway. They were silent. The world had collapsed around them. They
stood on its wreckage, speechless. I walked over and took the folder from Grant's slackened hands. Then I looked him straight in the eye. There was no longer anger or smugness in them, only emptiness. "My place is not cleaning your office bathroom, Grant," I said. My voice, calm and steady, rang out in the garden silence like a judgment. "My place is at the head of the table. The very table where your father made his decisions. The very table where you and this man," I nodded toward the petrified Arthur, "planned to betray his memory." I paused, allowing them to fully grasp the meaning of my words. "You are both fired as of this minute. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings from my office. I want you both off my property by evening. Get off my land." I turned and walked back toward the roses, not granting them a farewell glance. I didn't want to see their humiliation. Their defeat brought me no joy, only the bitter satisfaction of justice restored. Behind me, I heard a quiet, choked sound, a gasp, perhaps a sob, then hurried, scraping footsteps on the gravel. A car door slammed, then a second. The engine roared, and the squeal of tires on the gravel tore through the silence of my garden. And then everything was quiet. They were gone, forever. I stood alone amid the blooming roses. The air was clean and fresh again. I picked up the shattered orchid pot from the ground. The roots were intact. I knew it would survive. I would repot it, and it would bloom even more magnificently than before. The work wasn't over. It was just beginning. The legacy. The next morning, for the first time in many years, I arrived at the office not as a guest, but as the owner. I walked into the building, and it felt as if the familiar aromas of tea and chocolate greeted me differently, with respect. Miss Davis, Victor's secretary, met me at the entrance. Her eyes were red from crying, but this time they were tears of relief. She silently took my coat, and that simple gesture held more loyalty and support than 1,000 words. The first thing I did was enter the study. Grant's glossy portrait still hung on the wall, alien and false. I took it down without looking and handed it to Miss Davis with the words, "Dispose of this."
Then I walked to the corner where Victor's portrait was propped against the wall. I gently lifted it, wiping away the dust. He looked at me with his wise, slightly wary smile, and in his eyes I read approval. I hung it on its rightful place myself. The soul of the company had returned home. Next, I summoned the department heads and the legal counsel. I didn't give a grand speech. I simply said, as of today, pursuant to the final will of my husband, I am taking office as the Chief Executive Officer of the Sterling Reserve. All orders given by Grant Holloway are annulled. No one asked a single question. I saw relief in their eyes. That same day, 2 letters left my office. The first, short and official, was addressed to the legal department of Omnicorp. It stated that the Sterling Reserve had not, was not, and would never be engaged in any merger negotiations with them. Any further attempts at contact would be considered hostile action. The second letter was addressed to our lawyer. It was an order to initiate an investigation into the activities of former CFO Arthur Vance on charges of fraud and attempted damages to the company in an exceptionally large amount. The mechanism of justice was set in motion. And then I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I packed a small suitcase and headed to the airport. This was my first business trip, but I wasn't flying to sign contracts or discuss logistics chains. I was flying to Brussels to have dinner with a friend. Charlotte and I sat in a cozy little restaurant on the Grand Place. The air swelled of waffles, chocolate, and Old Stone. We drank burgundy wine and talked about everything. Our husbands, our children, how quickly life had flown by. We said almost nothing about business. Only at the very end of dinner did Charlotte take my hand, look me in the eye, and say, "Victor would be so proud of you, May. You didn't just save a company, you saved our shared history." New bloom. Several months passed. Winter gave way to spring and spring to summer. And one day I was standing in our tasting room. It was my favorite place in the office, a bright room with a huge oak table covered in samples of our products. But today it was particularly noisy and joyful. All my old friends were gathered around the table. Charlotte, who had flown in from Brussels, the smiling Mr. Sundaram from Sri Lanka, the elegant Mr. Laurent from France. They hadn't come for a board meeting. They had come for the launch of a new product. Small, elegant jars of pear.
A confectioner stood on the table. This was my first personal recipe. In it, the sweetness of Belgian pears was combined with a spicy note of Ceylon cinnamon and the delicate aroma of French brandy. It wasn't just a dessert, it was a symbol of our alliance. I picked up one of the jars. It was warm from the light of the lamps. I looked at the faces of my friends, at their happy, interested eyes, and I smiled. "We will call it the Charlotte," I announced, and my voice was firm and clear. I looked at my friend, and her eyes filled with tears of joy, in honor of true partnership, in honor of a friendship that proved to be stronger than any contract and more valuable than any money. The applause erupted. I looked at these people, at the fruits of our joint labor, and for the first time in many months, I felt not just peace, but true, quiet happiness. I had saved my husband's legacy, but I hadn't stopped there. I had begun to create my own. I saved the soul of the company, not with spreadsheets and stock tickers, but with respect. I wasn't just in my place. I had finally found it, and I was free. And that brings to a close the story of Maya Holloway. It is a story of quiet strength, of a dignity that cannot be stripped away, and of how true values, respect, loyalty, and human relationships sometimes prove to be a much greater capital than money and formal power. This narrative is not so much about business as it is about legacy, about the fact that some things cannot be sold, and honor once lost cannot be bought back for any millions. Maya did not just save a company. She saved the soul of the business, to which she and her husband had dedicated their entire lives. But let us consider, do the ends always justify the means? The main question this story leaves is, did Maya do the right thing? Undoubtedly, her son and his accomplice deserved punishment for their betrayal and greed. But Grant, her only flesh and blood, her son, was her decision to banish him forever the only correct one? Was there only cold justice in her actions, or was there also the bitterness of deep maternal resentment? How would you have acted in her place? Do you consider her actions just retribution, or perhaps too harsh a decision toward her own child? We would be incredibly interested to know what you think. Share your opinion in the comments below this video. If you have any questions or are curious about any details of this story, be sure to write about them. And of course, if this story touched you, please like and subscribe to our channel. Your support is the best reward for us and an incentive to continue telling you new, equally compelling stories.
Thank you for spending this time with us and listening to the end. We wish you all the best. At the end of this video, a window will appear in the center of the screen. Click on it to watch our other most compelling stories.